World War II was a time which now seems almost mythic, when the entire world was in peril from enormous forces of tyranny, led by the Axis powers of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. It was a time of unrestrained cruelty and mass murder, but also of legendary bravery and courage. Every fighting unit of the Allied forces had their heroes, be they soldier, sailor, or airman. Some are well known. Others wait for their story to be told, their song to be sung. Memories, as time passes, slowly dim, and the brave members of the Allied fighting forces, like all old soldiers, fade away, leaving behind little more than the stories they told to their families. The following is the story of one unsung group of pilots who stood up to be counted when the time came to fight back. They were young men who, like all of us, had hopes and dreams of their future. When all was darkest, they did not cower or run. They stood firm and chose to fight. Many of them gave the ultimate sacrifice in that fight. This is our tribute to these men who were feared and known by their enemies as Checkertails. The 325th Fighter Group came into existence on the 24th of June, 1942, and in late July of the same year, General Order No. 50, sanctioned by 1st Air Force Headquarters, Eastern Defense Command, activated the newly formed unit. Recruits were primarily selected from the 79th Fighter Group, which was made up of enlisted men of the 85th, 86th, and 87th Fighter Squadrons, all under the command of Major Leonard C. Lydon. Theater Green Field at Hillsgrove, Rhode Island, became the group's headquarters and the home of the 317th Fighter Squadron. The 318th was assigned to Grenier Field at Manchester, New Hampshire. The 319th made their home at Rentschler Field in Hartford, Connecticut. Work began immediately on gathering further personnel from officer candidate schools, Army Air Force schools, other fighter squadrons, and civilian induction centers. Jack Sherburne recalls being recruited into the United States Army Air Force.
Well, I had to get my mother's signature. My dad had long since died. And as she signed, she was in tears. But I didn't think I'd have too much trouble getting signatures, but I also had to get letters of recommendation. And I thought that might be a little difficult. But it worked, and I was accepted, but I had to wait until after I graduated. I pretty well decided I wanted to fly. And you know, as a teenager, I was pretty much impressed with P-40s that were doing dive bombing runs on Long Island Sound, of all places. And I thought they were so beautiful. That's what I need to do. You know, he had no great love for the Nazis either. That was a motivation. We were all more than willing to take a whack at them. So I thought I'd try it that way.
Training began at once. Although Allied ground troops were making steady inroads against the Axis forces in North Africa under Rommel's command, they were still unable to get the foothold that would turn the battle. As the days turned into months, the Allies decided to prioritize their efforts in the North African theater. The 325th had to reach operational readiness as soon as possible. Frank Bolick explains how not everything went to plan during training.
2 weeks before I was going to graduate from advanced training, I was called up before the commanding officer of the base and asked me if I had been flying inverted during my practice session that afternoon. He asked me how long I had been flying inverted, and I told him about 15-20 seconds. He says, "No, you weren't." I was flying for over a minute, and because of that, the commanding officer claimed that I should no longer be able to fly, and I was washed out and confined to barracks, and I felt that my flying days were over. After 2 weeks, I discovered that I just had been washed back one class. Apparently, they must have felt that they had invested too much money in getting me to fly, so they allowed me to go into the next class. You never saw anybody fly as straight and level as I did that last month. I feel that being washed out probably saved my life, because that class was shipped directly to Italy with no additional transition flying time in P-40s. Now, the class that I graduated in, we spent over 5 months flying in P-40s, 2-a-day practices, which allowed me to build up about 130 hours of flying time in P-40s.
With Gordon H. Austin taking over as commanding officer, the group was operationally ready by the 10th of December 1942. On January 1st, 1943, the group was ordered to relocate to Langley Field, Virginia. First and foremost in their training, the pilots were taught to take off from a very short runway. They soon began to realize, even though it was still undisclosed, that this was simulating the maximum possible distance for takeoff and landing procedures aboard an aircraft carrier. Finally, on January 7th, the pilots took to the air in P-40 Warhawks, headed for the Norfolk Naval Air Station. Shortly after, the P-40s took to the air once more, this time hoisted by cranes onto the deck of the USS Ranger. Early on the morning of January 8th, the powerful engines of the Ranger fired up, and with dockyard crews cheering, the huge aircraft carrier pulled away from its moorings and slowly headed off into the bright morning sunlight. 11 days later, on January 19th, the pilots readied themselves and the crews prepared the P-40s for takeoff. Captain Durgan, commander of the aircraft carrier, received confirmation that the Ranger was now within reach of the group's destination, Kazes Aerodrome, Casablanca. The order for the pilots to board their planes was given, and a huge rousing cheer sounded throughout the ship. Gordon Austin, then group commander of the 325th, recalls the events of that day, culminating in his leading the P-40s off the deck of the Ranger.
No, I was a group commander. If you notice in that film, we got the whole picture. That's the whole 325th Fighter Group, everything. All the young pilots, both squadrons. I remember that day was a rather poor day. It was rainy and a little bit kind of sort of cloudy and foggy. Well, I was very concerned about it, of course, because none of these kids had flown before off a deck. It took X number of feet, let's just say 1,500 feet to get a fighter off the P-40 off the deck. We had about 700 feet to get off, something like that. And they kept saying, "Boss, this thing isn't going to work." And so I talked to them the whole trip when they over there, that spare time, about the reason for the air that the carrier gets over the deck, other things like that. Well, the procedure was, of course, to line up towards the direction you're taking off. The wind, of course, is the carrier has put the wind across in the proper direction, so you're headed into the wind. Picks up a little speed, the carrier, and also it takes any natural wind. And you simply line up. As I remember, the specific procedures with the P-40 was you sat there, brakes on, gave it power, max power, a little flap sound, and at the point they take the brakes off, and you're just going. Keep the airplane going straight, and you got the flaps down to a certain degree, what you thought was correct. When you get to the end of the flight deck, you start to lift off, and you get airborne, and you pull your flaps up, and you're off and away.
Ken Rusher recalls his briefing on the deck of the USS Ranger.
They would have all the planes that were behind the takeoff line manned and running and in order. They would taxi up to the start line, put down 20 degrees of flaps, set brakes, check mags, and run up to military power. 42 manifold pressure. If the pilot was satisfied with the engine, he nodded to the air officer and waited for the flag to drop, then firewalled it. A few seconds on the deck and you were flying. You'd better be, the ship was gone. Since everything about the 325th went by the numbers, the 319th took off last, so we got to watch everyone else. We also wanted to know if we could come back aboard if we had engine trouble. The air officers said no. We didn't have an arresting hook on our plane. Belly in next to one of the escorting destroyers and they'd pick us up. He didn't say how quick. We said that we could easily belly in on the deck of the Ranger. Well, he got irate and brought to our attention all the quad 50s and 20mm guns ringing the flight deck, and that he'd be taking bets that we wouldn't make it to the deck. He also explained how many men and gallons of fuel were on board and said we weren't worth the risk. His final words before I buckled into my seat were very clear. If you get into trouble, belly in next to a destroyer and they would pick you up. Shortly after, I left the deck of the Ranger pulling 90 miles an hour and headed off to Africa. Deep down, I was glad I didn't have to find out how cold the water was and just how quickly they'd pick me up.
Finally, all 72 P-40s aboard the Ranger were clear of the deck, and with one last fly past for the carrier's personnel, the 325th Fighter Group was on its way to war. After a brief stay at Kazes, the pilots again took to the skies and headed for their new base at Meduna, where they arrived on January 23rd. The following day, orders came through that they were to fly cover for President Franklin Roosevelt at Casablanca during one of his official visits in which he would see the progress of the United States Army in the North African theater of battle. Although during this brief diversion no enemy were encountered, at last the fighter group felt it was becoming part of the war effort. As January dragged into February, and still with no sign of the 325th getting their first combat experience, the pilots of the group made the most of the time they had to get some much-needed air experience under their belts. Tragically, on the 11th of February, death came sooner than anyone had expected. While practicing formation flying, Lieutenant Joe Bloomer and Lieutenant George Gingris's planes collided while in the middle of a loop. Bloomer managed to bail out of his stricken aircraft and parachuted safely to the ground. Gingras was not so lucky. Ground crews watched helplessly as his P-40 spun out of control from 6,000 feet and plummeted into the ground with the young pilot losing his life. As the sun shone down above Casablanca later that day, the body of Gingras was laid to rest. 5 P-40s of the 318th flew across the sky overhead in the missing man formation in honor of their fallen comrade. As February reached its end, the 318th and 319th squadrons were moved to Tafaraoui, a former French Air Force base, while the 317th remained at Kazes, awaiting the arrival of more P-40s. During their stay at the base, the group started an intense program of low-level flying, navigation techniques, formation flying, and gunnery practice, for which the nearby lake of Oran was equipped with varying sizes of target. During this time, the group were also tasked with escort duty for shipping convoys arriving from the United States in an effort to keep the supply lines active for air and ground forces. On returning from these duties, it was then off to the briefing room for in-depth lectures and instruction from Colonel Philip Cochrane, already by that time a legendary pilot and leader. Cochrane, more often than not, would finish his lectures by pointing out that flak shouldn't be something to concern themselves with, as the P-40's operational altitude still fell inside its range. With a smile on his face, he said, "The easiest thing to do is just ignore it." On April 5, 1943, the 318th and 319th Fighter Squadrons took off and flew to their new operational base, situated on a plateau 3,500 feet above sea level at Montesquieu, Algeria. This passed almost without incident, except for Lieutenant William M. Lott, who, while attempting to land, crashed into a house situated close to the runway. Although he escaped with minor injuries, the same could not be said for his plane, which was seen the next day mangled and abandoned near the engineers' huts, waiting to be stripped for spare parts. The following days saw the pilots familiarizing themselves with the surrounding terrain and landmarks, and acclimatizing themselves to the new weather conditions. They knew that the group would soon be called into action, and this knowledge of their local surroundings could make all the difference in the months to come as to whether they made it home in one piece or died trying. On April 17, 1943, pilots of the 325th were at last called to action. They were to join a formation of bombers of the 321st Bombardment Group and fly escort to protect them from enemy fighters that were known to be patrolling the area. At 4:45 p.m., 22 P-40s of the 318th and 14 P-40s of the 319th thundered down the runway into a bright, clear sky, heading for their rendezvous point with the bombers. Shortly after, the pilots caught sight of their charges and moved into formation in varying positions of high, low, and side cover. For the next 20 minutes, the P-40s patrolled around the bomber formation. Then suddenly, the radio network burst into life. Barely noticeable against the blazing sun, a flash of metal caught the attention of the fighter squadron. In a heartbeat, pilots of the 318th turned toward their quarry. Suddenly over the radio came the message that there were 2 enemy 109s swooping in from high above, diving towards the formation of bombers, firing both cannon and machine guns. Miraculously, not one bullet struck home. The 109s, seeing that they were obviously outnumbered by the 325th, continued their dive and broke away, much to the frustration of the Allied airmen. Without further incident, the bombers finally reached their target, and with the payload dropped, explosions were seen across the target area, leaving a scene of devastation on the Axis-held territory below. That day, April 17, 1943, marked the start of a run of 59 escort missions for the 325th Fighter Group, during which not one single bomber would be lost to enemy fighters. This extraordinary feat would significantly raise the profile of the group, not only in the eyes of Air Force headquarters, but more importantly, in the eyes of the Luftwaffe, whose pilots had already started to fear the sight of the fighter escort approaching with the bomber formations, as the bombers would no longer be easy pickings for the might of the Luftwaffe. Over the following days, the 318th and 319th carried out more escort missions, all of which resulted in the bombers coming home, and although not damaged by enemy fighters, some had taken their fair share of flak on the way to and from their target areas. Ultimately, all made it back, including all the P-40s of the 325th. On April 29th, the 325th was given the task of using the P-40s for dive bombing attacks against targets in Cape El Drec. For this mission, 12 P-40s of the 318th were loaded with 500-pound bombs, with a further 24 P-40s of the 319th escorting them to the target. At 1700 hours, both squadrons arrived at Cape El Drec. The Warhawks, loaded with bombs, started their descent toward the target. Gathering speed, which would make them much harder to hit on their approach by flak and ground fire, until finally they released their bombs. The new tactic paid off as the payload struck with devastating accuracy. Ship after ship exploded in a shower of water and shrapnel. The P-40s then used their guns to strafe and beat up the area, damaging several more ships before they pulled away. While this was happening, Colonel Gordon Austin and his flight took the opportunity to strafe a selection of smaller vessels, sinking at least 5, before he used the last of his ammunition on the lighthouse at the entrance to the Cape. The following day, the side of Austin's P-40, number 44, could be seen sporting the freshly painted nose art proclaiming his newly named plane, Lighthouse Louis. As each mission completed, and the pilots returned to base to be debriefed, a noticeable air of frustration was sensed building within the group. This all stemmed from the feeling that even though the missions so far had seen ships, vehicles, and buildings all being successfully destroyed, the one question that remained for them was, when will we score our first aerial victory? On May the 6th, 1943, that question would be answered. 12 P-40s of the 318th Fighter Squadron were tasked with carrying 500-pound bombs to destroy more enemy shipping. Above them and flying cover were 24 P-40s of the 319th, who watched as the 318th reached their target area and scored hits on multiple targets before strafing the rest of the smaller vessels, leaving the sea a billowing mass of fire, oil, smoke, and debris. All the P-40s turned for home, with thoughts of celebrations again in the mess after another successful mission chalked up for the 325th. However, Lieutenants Harmon Burns and Frank Collins, and flight officers Richard Catlin and Edmund Parent all became separated from the main group. As the four searched the sky for any trace of their fellow airmen, they spotted approximately 20 Ju-52s lined up on the landing strip of a nearby base. Seizing the chance, they took turns to attack the stationary aircraft and hangars around the airfield, all without any significant response from the ground. As they pulled away, happy with their impromptu attack, Lieutenant Collins lost sight of the remainder of his flight, and with no other choice, set a heading for home as he only had a limited amount of fuel for the return journey. Shortly, he spotted a Bf-109, wheels down, on final approach, and unseen by the enemy pilot, he pulled his Warhawk in behind the 109 and from point-blank range unleashed everything that he had in his guns. The pilot never stood a chance, and as Collins peeled away, he watched the 109 plunge earthward before exploding on impact with the runway. At the same time as Collins' victory, Lieutenant Harmon Burns had also become separated from the flight. With no other choice, Burns set a bearing home, but shortly afterwards he caught sight of a lone Ju-52. Burns unleashed a barrage along the length of the fuselage. He then watched as the out-of-control plane steadily dived earthward before exploding beneath him. At last, the aerial score had been opened for the 325th, But as for who got the first victory, even now that's open to speculation. Collins' victory is listed first in the mission intelligence reports, but Lieutenant Burns is listed first to score at the foot of the same page. All that mattered then was that finally the 325th was taking the war to the enemy, and this time they proved themselves worthy combatants in the air as well as the ground. The frustration that the pilots had felt lifted immediately. As dawn broke on May the 13th, news from headquarters confirmed that the Axis forces in North Africa had all but been wiped out. General von Arnim had surrendered what was left of his depleted and demoralized army. This brought the North African campaign to its conclusion. The 325th Fighter Group were now directed in an effort to carve a path through the Axis forces in the Mediterranean toward the eventual goal of Italy, with initial missions focused against the strongholds of Pantelleria, Sicily, and Sardinia. In the days that followed, pilots undertook a variety of bombing, strafing, and escort missions, with successes against shipping, E-boats, power stations, and enemy supply lines. As these missions were underway, the final P-40s that would bring the 317th Fighter Squadron up to combat readiness were being delivered to their base at Tafarawi. 2 days later, May 19th, was to be the day of the first combat mission for the now full-strength 325th Fighter Group. Also at this time, the Axis forces appeared to significantly increase in number. During the North Africa campaign, it was all too obvious that the enemy were on their last legs and fighting a desperate war. Now, however, in the Mediterranean, many more fighters were crowding into the skies in a bid to stave off the Allied attacks. The mission undertaken on the 19th of May saw the Warhawks of the 325th escorting B-25 bombers to the air depot at Decimo Manu in Sardinia. This was also the first combat mission for Herschel Green, who during the long monotonous days waiting for the 317th to reach its full complement of P-40s had been eagerly anticipating the day of his first combat flight. Herschel, who had been nicknamed Herky after staff at his training school shortened his original nickname of Hercules, would later go on to be the 325th's top fighter ace. He soon realized that this mission wasn't going to be the milk run that the group claimed it would be. Arthur Fiedler describes the events of the day as told to him by Herky after the war.
On Herky's first mission, he told me how they flew an excellent formation. The problem was they were flying real good formation and watching each other so that there's good formation flying, that they didn't see the Germans coming down and attack them. As a result, the Germans came down from above and attacked the 317th Fighter Squadron on its first mission, and they caught the 317th with its pants down. Now, fights are breaking out all over, swirling all over. Somehow or another, they got Herky off. 6 109s got Herky off to the side, and they were turning Herky every way but loose. Herky got a victory that day. He made a head-on pass with a 109, and the 109 blew up as it passed Herky. Herky was sure that this was his last day to be alive. They were making passes at him and so forth, but he was always able to turn first one way and then another way to avoid them. And all of a sudden he looked up, and here were 2 of them right on his tail. And they were coming down, you know, like this on either side. And he knew whatever way he turned, the other guy was going to get him. So about this time, 20 millimeter shell explodes right behind his armor plate, takes out the radio. He's already had his instrument panel shot out with machine gun fire. He's been wounded, nicked. When that 20 millimeter shell hit behind him and these 2 guys are coming into him, he said, "I don't know what I did," he said, "but I think I pulled that stick back and kicked the rudder as hard as I could, And he said, next thing I knew, the airplane went up over like that into a spin. And he also said that he had had the supercharger on all this time, and the battle had lasted over 10 minutes, okay? And he said the airplane was smoking, and so as he started down in his spin, he thinks that the Germans were sure they had got him, and they didn't follow him down. But he followed down, went down into the clouds, and then he headed for home in the clouds. He said when he came out of the clouds, he said, I was sure there was going to be some Germans waiting for me, and I was looking all around, but there were no Germans. So he goes flying back to base. About that time, another 40 comes up to him, joins formation with him. The guy looks at Herky's airplane, and he goes, flew under him, and looked at the other side of the airplane. He said, Herky said, you know, he's waiting like that. So Herky comes down and finally gets the airplane on the ground. Now, the rumor was among the enlisted men that there wasn't one longeron in Herky's airplane that wasn't severed in at least one place. So the airplane was kind of flying on a wing, or what you had left of the wings in a prayer.
Herky considered the events of the day, and although not superstitious, his mind turned toward the large number 13 painted on the fuselage of his plane. Zach Taylor, a good friend by then, listened as Herky talked with other pilots about number 13 and offered to trade his number 11 for Herky's plane. Herky jumped at the offer, and from then until the end of his combat tour with the 325th, Herky always took his trusty number 11 into battle when possible. The following days saw victories for the fighter group with a variety of Me-109, Me-323, 7 of which were downed in one sortie, and Italian Mach-E fighter planes, all falling to the guns of the group. By the end of the 40th mission, the chalkboard in the mess read, victories 25, losses 8, and sorties 813. In between missions, Captain Robert Myers of the 319th had been spending his time experimenting to find out the P-40's maximum payload. After many trials, some precariously close to crashing on takeoff, he managed to get airborne with a 1,000-pound bomb strapped centrally to the underbelly of the Warhawk. Once the news spread to other members of the group, each took turns in repeating what Myers had achieved, and over the next few days the pilots became proficient at the difficult takeoff maneuver, which could take almost the full length of the runway. This feat for the 325th became unique in the theater of war, as they were the only group to succeed in carrying such a large bomb on the P-40. At 0600 hours on June the 1st, as a low sun steadily burned off an early morning mist, 36 P-40s, 12 from each squadron, set off for the target of the Stagnone seaplane base in Sicily. This base was seen as a target of high priority, as the aircraft there were used to ferry supplies of food, ammunition, and fuel to the mainland. The tactical advisors at headquarters wanted to make sure that it was destroyed, as this would mean one less supply line available to the enemy. June 6th through the 19th saw more attacks from the group, including escort missions and high-level bombing runs, with the P-40s carrying either the 500-pound or the 1,000-pound payload. During other bombing and escort missions, it was noted that there were an increasing number of enemy fighter planes willing to try their luck against the Allied air forces. As Me-109s flew against the bomber streams and fighter escorts, These hotly contested dogfights resulted in an ever-increasing victory tally chalked up for the pilots of the 317th, 318th, and 319th. After each mission, tales would be told throughout the mess hall of dogfights, near misses, a victory here, the bullet with my name on it, but also talk of another friend and pilot not returning from the fight. However, one thing never changed. At the beginning of each day, these young pilots, with a maturity beyond their years, courageously climbed back into the cockpits of their planes and reached high into the sky once more. While the 325th was stationed at Montesquieu, the Air Force put out a request for all fighter and bomber groups to design an individual paint scheme, so that bomber groups heading to and from their target interception point could identify which groups were escorting them, as well as allowing them to quickly identify if it was a friendly or enemy aircraft approaching the formation. This request was a change in direction for the Air Force, which had up until then not permitted units to identify themselves individually, reasoning that it would give the enemy a certain advantage from an intelligence point of view. However, as the pilots and chiefs of the 325th pointed out, they were almost exclusively the only group flying in the airspace of areas such as Sardinia, were already well known, and had indeed been mentioned in the Axis propaganda radio. From now on, the 325th would have the chance to strike fear into the enemy pilots from their recognizable markings, as well as relief into the hearts of bomber pilots who would now know the 325th were escorting and protecting them. The task of designing the group's pattern fell to Major Bob Baszler and Captain John Watkins. Baszler had always been impressed by the artwork used around the fuselage of World War I fighter ace Werner Voss. The pattern consisted of a group of large black and white squares and became immediately recognizable by other fighter pilots, leading to Voss being called the checkerboard ace. So with paint sprayers in hand, the duo set about creating the first checkerboard pattern to adorn the rear of the group's P-40s, and this is where the famous yellow and black checkertail pattern applied to the tail of Baszler's P-40 came into existence. With the squares measuring 12 inches by 12 inches and using orange, yellow, and solid black, the design was forwarded for approval to Group Commander Colonel Austin, which he gave without hesitation. Seeking final approval, Colonel Austin sent Captain John Watkins to deliver the design by hand to Major General Carl Spaatz, who, as luck would have it, was friends with John's family. Word came back almost immediately that the design was passed, and work started over the following days to apply the paint scheme to the tails of the 325th P-40s. From May to July of 1943, each mission and sortie flown by the fighter squadrons of the 325th added to its growing victory tally. By then, the group had moved to Matur Airfield, a dry and dusty strip near Bizerte, Tunisia. The ground was cracked and baked hard from the previous month's lack of rainfall, and the conditions weren't helped by the swarms of flies and grasshoppers, the latter of which took delight in feeding on anything they could get to, including rifle straps and mosquito netting. Crawling insects, too, had to be deterred from trying their luck against the planes by digging small trenches around the wheels and filling them with oil, which in the short term seemed to do the trick. During the group's first missions flown from the base, a variety of enemy planes were downed, including a 109 shot down by Captain Bun Hearn, Jr. Hearn was the son of the famous St. Louis Cardinals and Boston Braves baseball player, now staking his own claim for fame. This dogfight extended from San Pietro and continued until it was 60 miles out to sea, concluding in another victory for the 325th. The missions flown by the group through June to July saw more victories for the pilots, with 109s falling from the skies and German oil depots destroyed. July 20th saw P-40s of the 325th, laden with fragmentation bombs, carry out an attack against the air depot at Decimo Manu, in which the Checkertails destroyed 5 parked 109s along with 3 Ju-52s. Then, 12 enemy aircraft which had been scrambled earlier suddenly appeared and tore into their group. Flight Officer George Dickus was downed in their first pass, but with their initial surprise lost, the 325th turned into their attackers and paid them back with interest. Captain Zach Taylor engaged the lead plane, a Mach-E 202, which seconds later, minus a wing, plunged earthwards. He picked another of the attackers, jammed hard on his rudder, and locked onto the tail of the enemy. With another burst of the guns, Taylor watched as the pilot climbed from the cockpit and tumbled away from his out-of-control plane. Finally, he spotted a 109 making a turn onto another P-40, and rolling hard, he came in for his attack. Within seconds, the 109 had been critically damaged and plunged into the ground. Zach Taylor had scored the group's first triple kill, but not only that, the 3 victories now added to his previous 3, and Taylor became the group's first ace. Mission 103 was to be a defining moment for the 325th. They were tasked with a fighter sweep in southern Sardinia, where the 317th and 319th Fighter Squadron were to make a rendezvous and continue together. This failed to materialize, and the 319th returned to base frustrated by the lack of coordination by the 317th. What they didn't realize was that the 317th had been spotted by enemy fighters and were now in a huge fight on the valley floor between Oristano and Cagliari. 317th pilots by now were experienced in the Warhawks and realized that its strength was in its turning ability. As the enemy pounced, the 325th fighters broke into pairs and, working as teams, set about attacking the enemy. One after another, the Warhawks got into firing positions behind the enemy planes, and soon the valley floor was covered in fire, smoke, and the shattered remains of 109s and Mach-Es. As the fight progressed, one of the young pilots, Robert S. Saderberg from Cook County, Illinois, was seen on numerous occasions to maneuver his P-40 in behind an enemy aircraft that was in the process of lining up a shot on a Warhawk. And with exceptional gunnery, he would either send it plunging earthward or force it to break off its attack. Saderberg was reported to have shot down at least 5 aircraft that day, witnessed by other pilots, but was only credited for 1 destroyed. With a sky full of tracer and aircraft jostling for firing position, it was soon apparent that the P-40 pilots of the 317th were gaining the upper hand. Even when it looked like they might be in trouble, the P-40's turning ability could soon swing the balance in favor of the Allied pilot. However, not all the pilots were so lucky. One of the P-40s was seen to be in a struggle for survival with multiple enemy aircraft on its tail. The remaining pilots were still engaged in their own fights and could only watch helplessly as an ever-increasing number of enemy aircraft latched onto the lone P-40's tail and sent stream after stream of tracer into its fuselage. Flight leader Bud Walker found himself engaged at one point with 3 Messerschmitt 109s, but Walker, using all of his skill, managed to evade the enemy's attack. On one pass, Bud hit the rudder hard right and managed to skid his plane into a position for a shot at the tail of one of the fighters. With one long burst, he raked fire across the whole rear end of the plane and watched as it tumbled out of control before impacting with the deck. At the same moment, he caught sight of one of the other 109s coming at him for a head-on attack, and another stream of fire from the Warhawk hit home, and Bud watched as the Messerschmitt caught fire and exploded just ahead of his plane, with flames and debris narrowly missing his P-40. This left just one more bandit, but this 109 pilot was good. No matter what maneuver Bud made, the 109 stuck with him like glue, and each second saw another stream of tracer narrowly miss Bud's plane. Finally, a few feet off the ground, and in desperation, Bud pulled hard back on the stick. The 109 pilot reacted and pulled hard back trying to follow, but lost control and went into a stall. Seconds later, the wreckage of one more enemy aircraft was scattered across the valley floor. Bud Walker had survived and was credited with 3 kills that day, one of them without even firing a bullet. Eventually, the P-40s of the 317th inflicted enough damage onto the Axis side that they gave up the fight, turned tail, and ran. the 317th pilots, battered and bruised and with fuel running perilously low, regrouped and headed back to base. On arrival, they discovered that there was only one aircraft missing, that of Robert S. Saderberg, the pilot who was seen on so many occasions to save so many others from tragedy. Fortunately, it was later discovered that Saderberg was not killed and had been made a prisoner of war. Interestingly, Chet Sluter, who was group commander at the time, was sent to Sardinia on September 23rd after the armistice had been declared with Italy, and there met some of the enemy pilots who had been involved against the 317th during Mission 103. During the conversation, he was asked how many aircraft were claimed shot down by the fighter group, and Sluter replied that the claims for that day's action had been 21 shot down, 4 damaged, and several probables. The Italian pilots then informed him that the group had underclaimed, as their records showed that they had lost over 30 aircraft. This detail seems to confirm the memory of the 317th pilots who had seen Robert S. Saderberg shoot down at least 5 aircraft, although the official records show he was only credited with 1 victory. There is still strong feeling that Saderberg was an uncredited ace for the 325th. That evening, as the crews rested, ready for the next day's action, Axis Sally, as the pilots affectionately called her, was on the radio, reporting on the battle. She was heard to say, "We will remember you, the Checkertail butchers," which, even though said with contempt, was taken as a compliment by the pilots. She then went on to say again, "We will remember you, boys, and that old Checkertail clan." The Checkertails had just been immortalized in name by the very side who despised them so much. During their time at different bases, the pilots and ground crews endeavored to make their stay as comfortable as possible. It was not unheard of for essential items to be midnight requisitioned by the group through various unofficial channels for use in creating a home away from home. With dust and grime, the unbearable heat, and the incessant insects making their stay somewhat unbearable, the pilots and crews set about making a washing facility their highest priority. Captain John Watkins, one of the group's senior improvisers, set about creating a shower cubicle, and with equipment such as belly tanks, wooden crates, gasoline, and copper tubing, Watkins soon had the much-needed facility up and running. He then christened the shower cubicle La Douche Supreme. Beneath the name, written in much smaller print, were the words, "Exclusively for the lighthouse boys. Ladies are invited." Belly tank and wing tank crates soon found other uses and became much sought-after commodities. In skilled hands, which the 325th had no shortage of, this metal could be turned into many useful items for the staff at the base, examples of which were flooring for the tents, furniture, and even musical instruments for the Checkertail Symphony Orchestra. Another high note for the crews were the morale-boosting tours by popular film and theater stars of the day, and the 10th of August saw the arrival in camp of Bob Hope, Francis Langford, Jack Pepper, Hildegard, and Tony Romano. The group had sent their B-25, nicknamed Passion Flower II, over to El Alwina Airport near Tunis, with a delegation of hand-selected, or as the other unit members said, fixed personnel to greet them. One of the lucky ones being Lieutenant Colonel Baszler, who had taken over from Colonel Austin as the group's commanding officer. After the show and the awards of medals to some of the pilots by Miss Langford, she heard about Captain Watkins' shower cubicle and put in a special request to Watkins for the use of La Douche Supreme. Miss Langford was obviously impressed with the setup, as the departure time for the entertainers became delayed by her ablutions. In the meantime, Bob Hope asked Colonel Baszler if he could see what it was like to be involved in a mission. And without further ado, Baszler and Hope climbed aboard the group's B-25 and headed off over the Mediterranean, just above sea level. To complete the effect, 2 Warhawks were scrambled to fly escort. As Baszler and Hope entered into an imaginary bomb run, the B-25 unleashed its guns with a display of firepower that brought a smile to Hope's face. Without a doubt, this form of entertainment had impressed one of the most famous actors of the era. Finally, the guests left the base, but that day had certainly boosted the morale of the troops, as it was the only live entertainment most of them had seen since leaving America. Memories of the show would stay with them and be talked about for months. Not all events outside of the combat zone were as pleasant. One of the constant problems faced by the 325th was the young and eager pilots of the P-38 Lightnings who were stationed nearby. For some reason, these pilots seemed to think that anything with a single propeller must be an enemy aircraft, and on many occasions, P-38s could be seen diving towards a formation of the 325th's P-40s, making the group scatter, just in case some young hot rod was too eager to score instead of identifying the plane first. Finally, on a day when the P-38s were supposed to be flying top cover for the 325th but failed to show up, Lieutenant Colonel Basler had had a belly full. Arriving back at base with P-40s carrying more lead than they went out with, Basler ordered the ground crews to roll out Heumann, a Bf-109, which the group had liberated earlier in the campaign, finding it abandoned in a field of straw. Basler decided the time was right to show the pilots of the P-38 base what a 109 really looked like. Firing the engine up, Basler tore down the runway and pulled away from the base. He quickly covered the 3-mile distance separating the 325th and the P-38's base and roared low over the airfield. Months of pent-up frustration was finally spilling from him as he raced over the Lightnings parked neatly across the field. Pushing the throttle forward for maximum power, Basler climbed skywards, near vertically, before looping over and coming in for a second pass. As the 109 swooped down, Basler could only imagine the chaos unleashed as the base suddenly became aware to the fact that a single-engine fighter was swooping over their base. As Basler's 109 skimmed past pine trees, tents, and lightnings, he made certain that the pilots were getting to see what an enemy aircraft looked like. With a quick dip of his wing to see for one last time the chaos he had caused, Basler gunned the 109 for the 325th's home. On his arrival back at base, he told with glee of seeing infantrymen and officers scattering in all directions as he buzzed the field, much to the delight of the 325th's pilots and crew. Later on, Basler was summoned to explain his actions by the commanding officer of the 1st Fighter Group, Colonel Garman, who had been eating with the staff at the P-38 base and who also had to dive for cover. Basler explained about his frustration with the P-38 pilots and that it was only a matter of time before someone died. Garman conceded that he had a valid point, although he had questioned his parentage on hearing it was Basler who'd buzzed him. But over the following months, no more incidents were reported, and Heumann was put back in storage, ready for another reminder should it be needed. Finally, on August the 17th, the enemy's defense of Sicily caved in. Enemy soldiers were rounded up and placed in detention camps, while on the streets, civilians celebrated their liberation. General Doolittle, commander of Nassau, then ordered the group to concentrate its efforts against Sardinia in particular, and to take every chance to harass the enemy. The 325th was to destroy communication lines, shoot down enemy aircraft, take out supply lines, sink shipping, and anything that could possibly aid the Axis. Because Ju-88s were still conducting night raids against the North African seaports, these raids could easily be turned against the Allied forces, planning for a beachhead at Salerno on the 9th of September. Since the 325th would be the only group to operate in the theater, it was imperative that they cause as many problems as possible for the Axis forces in the days leading up to the 9th. Over the following days, many sorties and missions were flown. Each day saw the damage wrought by the group increase significantly as the P-40s dive-bombed power stations, factories, ships, bridges, aerodromes, and any buildings that could hold vital enemy equipment. On August the 28th, Captain Watkins, of La Douche Supreme fame, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross after turning back from his flight and heading towards a group of 30 Me-109s which had outnumbered and surprised the P-40s flying astern of him. In a show of outstanding marksmanship and bravery, Watkins attacked two 109s diving against a group of 4 P-40s, destroying one and severely damaging the other. Then he caught sight of another 2 109s dropping onto 4 more P-40s and shouted a warning over the radio. The P-40s broke, and Watkins went on to the offensive. He lined up the crosshairs of his guns against the nearest 109, which seconds later fell from the sky. Watkins then rolled his Warhawk in behind the previous victim's wingman and unleashed another stream of 50 caliber fire, which ripped chunks of the plane away. The enemy pilot turned tail and ran, leaving Watkins the opportunity to take on a 5th enemy fighter, which suffered the same consequence. Then, with his ammunition running low, Watkins and the remaining 325th Fighter Group pilots headed for home. His actions that day earned him the award of a DFC, which he proudly received. This was the last combat mission flown by the P-40s of the 325th. The final record for the P-40 era read 1,238 missions and 3,990 sorties completed, with a total of 10,121 combat hours flown, leading to 135 victories scored against a total of 35 losses. The total ordnance dropped 328,820 pounds. On September 22, 1943, the P-40 Warhawks of the 325th were finally withdrawn from combat. Between mid-September and the end of October 1943, the 325th was equipped with the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. As the pilots arrived back at base, a line of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts stood ready to take the 325th Fighter Group into the enemy skies. This new aircraft, with its 8 50 caliber machine guns, heavy armor, and multiple attack capabilities, would continue writing the legend of the Checkertail clan. Affectionately known as the Jug, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a combat aircraft superior to the P-40 and much better equipped to deal with the enemy's tactics against Allied bomber missions. It was the biggest, heaviest, and most expensive fighter aircraft in history to be powered by a single radial engine which at full throttle could develop 2,535 horsepower. Its 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 on each wing, could be loaded with a choice of armor-piercing incendiary, or armor-piercing incendiary tracer ammunition. In a ground attack role, this proved excellent at destroying thin-skinned and lightly armored Axis vehicles, as well as damaging some of the more heavily armored machines. It also proved just as effective against the enemy aircraft, with a short 1 or 2 second burst being enough to destroy or severely damage the opposition. With long-range fuel tanks, the added range enabled a P-47 to protect the bombers on raids all the way into Germany, and on the way back, strafe targets of opportunity. Using belly shackles, they could also carry bombs on short-range missions. The P-47 could perform with ease the dual functions of a fighter bomber. The Axis forces soon found that they were tackling the fastest diving American aircraft of the war. It could easily reach speeds in excess of 550 miles per hour, from which no piston engine Axis aircraft could escape in a rapid descent. Also, the P-47 was built around a truly resilient airframe. Pilots could often be heard talking about how their Thunderbolt had struck a tree or a power line or even been hit by enemy gunfire, but would still return the pilot safely back to base. Ed Doss, a crew chief with the 319th, explains the work necessary to return an aircraft to the front line.
We were assigned an airplane, and you did all the maintenance on it. You had to do all the pre-flighting and anything that had to be done, putting on wing tanks and pre-flighting and changing spark plugs or whatever. If there's a mechanical problem, you did it. If it was within your realm, you could do it And then if it was a more major repair or operation, there's an engineering section in the squadron. So they would send a couple of the engineering guys over there to help do what we had to do. But as the crew chief, you had the job of just make sure the darn thing was airworthy. Well, the first thing you did was you made a strong visual check of the airplane to see there wasn't any flak holes or something in there that would require attention. And then if the guns were fired, the first thing you know, they open up the wing compartments, and the armament guys go in there and they swab out the barrels and check the guns and reload them. He's doing all that while the crew chief is pulling the panels off, checking the airplane for leaks, filling up all the fluid, checking the tires, and just mainly make sure everything is perfect. And then when you pre-flight it, you had to check the prop at its right speeds. We used to like the P-47. We would have to go up to 2,400 RPM, and that old plane just jumping up and down on the ground. And you had to check the mags, the right and the left side, to make sure you were allowed so minimum drop in horsepower. And then you'd have to check the prop to make sure it rotated the pitch. The process was that when the pilot came in to the aircraft to fly it, he had to sign off on it. And on the sheet there was two boxes. One said no problem, so you never checked it. The other box, you put an X in it just to make him sign the form. It meant nothing. It meant some technical order that was totally insignificant. The plane could fly for 1,000 years and it wouldn't matter, but you made him sign, put a little technical flaw on there, so he was signed the release to go on the mission. And then when he would come back from the mission, we would converse with him and ask him, did you have any problems? And he'd say, it ran rough or something, radio didn't work too good. He reported back to us, and then if it was a radio, we'd have to go up to the radio shack and get the people down there to check the radio. And then in the meantime, we'd pull the cowling off, check for oil leaks, fill it up with fuel, and maintenance put oxygen in them, check all the fuel levels, the oil level, and check the tires, check the struts. You had to make sure that there were certain things you had to do, and they had to come to a standard.
The first of these new Thunderbolts arrived in style, being flown over the airfield at impressively low altitude by Colonel Baszler, much to the delight of the pilots waiting to get their hands on the new ride. Unfortunately, the weather delayed any chance of this, as the heavy rains made the airfield at Matur unusable. So the 325th relocated to Soliman in Tunisia on November 4th and quickly set about building their new runway of pierced steel planking. During their stay there, the 325th's close escort skill was honored with another mission to fly cover for the presidential party en route to the Tehran conference, successfully carried out without incident. The stay at Soliman was short-lived, and in early December the 325th headed for their new base in Foggia with their full complement of Thunderbolts. There was a constant requirement for new pilots to replace the previous ones. Arthur Fiedler recalls what it was like to arrive as a new recruit at a base.
The four of us brought the strength of the 317th up to 17 pilots. They had to put up 16 every day. So you obviously recognize there was a certain degree of relief that we were there to spell them, because before that they had been flying every mission every day. Now I guess you'd say out of every 16 days, one of them would get to stand down. So from that standpoint, I think they were pleased to have us. We all had a lot of P-47 time. I had 360 hours. So it wasn't like we were a bunch of early recruits and didn't know how to fly the airplane, so it didn't take us any time at all to be assimilated into the organization and be able to fly combat with them. So I think I would probably say in general they were fairly happy and fairly relieved that we came over there to help spell them out.
The group resumed its duties on the 14th of December with a bomber escort mission to Greece, which passed without incident. However, events were soon to change. Captain Frank Collins, taking part in a mission to Innsbruck, lost sight of his squadron over the target area. Rather than just heading for home, he found an enemy airbase to work over, strafing several planes, and a Ju-52 was destroyed. On the same mission, Major Louis Chick Jr., recently transferred from the 355th Fighter Group, also became separated from his flight. Once more, fortune favored the lost, as he spotted a 200-foot enemy boat moored at Roseto di Abruzzi, which he proceeded to chew up with his 850 caliber machine guns. But the Axis gunners opened up on Chick's Thunderbolt, and soon the air was filled with shrapnel from heavy anti-aircraft guns. On arriving back at base, Chick reported that he was pretty sure that was going to be his last mission. Fortunately, he'd been proved wrong. The pilots were now starting to appreciate the firepower and the ruggedness of the Thunderbolt, and at every chance they brought its strength to bear as they headed off to cause as much misery as possible to the Axis forces. On many occasions following these missions, pilots would return in battered and beaten up Thunderbolts, many completely irreparable, yet still they made it back to base, saving the pilot to fight another day. Tragically, on Christmas Day 1943, 3 pilots failed to return as bad weather closed in on the base. Lieutenants Slattery and Muller and Flight Officer William Watkins went missing in some of the worst conditions to hit the region since records began. A few days later, their bodies and wreckage of the P-47s were found on a nearby mountainside, just a few miles from the safety of the base. None of them showed signs of enemy involvement, leading to the conclusion that the weather had been the only factor in the deaths of the young pilots. As the year came to an end, the 325th was transferred to the base commonly known as Foggia No. 1, which turned out to be one of their favorite bases. First impressions weren't favorable, however, as on arrival at the field, the pilots were greeted by a mixture of mud, even thicker mud, and interspersed, as one pilot put it, by even more mud. But the conditions did not deter the pilots from their first mission from the base, and hours later, P-47s of the 325th rose into the sky and soon after were engaged in battle with 12 Me-109s. 3 enemy planes fell to the guns of the Checkertails, with no losses to the 325th. During January of 1944, the 325th was given a more strategic role by the 15th Air Force Command, with priority assigned to escorting bomber formations on missions deep into Axis territory, with most attention to targeting marshalling yards and rail lines. Orders were also given during pre-mission briefings that fighter pilots were not to chase enemy planes below 15,000 feet, as it would leave the bombers vulnerable to attack. This was frustrating to pilots who had to watch the enemy get away when they knew a few more seconds would scratch one more enemy plane. But they knew that getting to the target was of utmost importance, the main purpose of their presence, and all did their best to make that objective succeed. As the pilots logged more hours of combat in the P-47s, they grew to appreciate just how good an all-round machine the radial engine fighter truly was. Major Louis W. Chick Jr. shared his thoughts on the aircraft after the war.
The Jug proved to be a good airplane, which performed well against anything the Germans had at the time. In addition, it could take a terrific beating and come back for more. Our Jugs were all equipped with water injection. The factory word was 2,800 RPM maximum, with 52 inches of mercury manifold pressure dry and 56 inches wet. The 317th set their engines up to about 70 inches of mercury wet, which really gave the old Jug a kick in the pants for a few minutes, but it drove the factory up nuts. Anyway, it worked and we left them that way. With the doctrine I was teaching of turning the airplane gently and maintain an indicated airspeed of at least 250 miles an hour. We could outrun anything in there to give us trouble in combat. Our evasive action was to dive till you saw 500 miles an hour on the airspeed indicator, and you could be sure no one was behind you any longer, since they would have shed their wings by this time. Also, the airplane was faster than anything we were up against.
During this time, Chet Sluter requested that the Thunderbolt not be loaded with tracer ammunition.
When we got the jugs, I insisted we get rid of tracers and depend on the 100 mil sight. A lot of the old hands from Africa didn't like it, but the proof was in the pudding. A lot of times our gun camera showed the enemy didn't know he was being shot at until he was hit, but then it was too late for him to do anything about it. If you can hit the target, 50 cals will tear stuff up. Although we had eliminated the tracers from the standard loadout, 50 rounds before the end of the belt we added 5 tracers, so you had a warning you're about to run out of ammo.
This was approved, and the results from this decision were clearly borne out during the mission flown just 2 days later. As dawn broke on January 30th, 1944, the pilots prepared for an intercept mission attacking fighters taking off from an airfield in the Udina area. The day would result in the award of a Distinguished Unit Citation for their outstanding performance in the battle. Former P-47 pilot Gerald B. Edwards takes up the story.
Well, on 30 January 44, we were stationed at Foggia. Foggia 1 was the field. And the squadron commander called us in and said, well, guys, we're going on a mission tomorrow. And he said, it's pretty special. He said, only volunteers. Well, everybody was a volunteer in the fighter group. There wasn't any option for other than that. And he said, there's a DFC at a Purple Heart, he says. And the plan was to take off, and prior to takeoff, we set all our altimeters so that when they read 0, we were at 50 feet. And we flew the entire mission at 50 feet. That was over 2 hours over water in a fog. As soon as we were in low level coming around the village, that Foggia, below the stacks, you know, and we got out, we drifted right down to the seashore and leveled out the 12 ships behind each other. 61 of us. The spare came along on the mission. And we had it set at 50 feet. And we had orders not to turn any radios on because they might reveal where we are. And we're going to fly the whole Adriatic Sea in the middle until we got almost to northern Italy. That's when we pulled out. But on the way up, it was amazing because we ran into a ground fog a few miles off the coast. And you could see only 8 or 10 planes at once in this fog. And looking ahead of you, you could see the guy's wing tanks making bulges in the water and his engine leaving trail, water behind him. And you were doing the same thing. And you were sagging up and down a little bit, you know. The group commander must have done an incredibly smooth job of leading 61 aircraft in that close formation, most of them in the fog. It was incredible. And before we went that day, I remember I said, well, what if we have to lose our engine? Can we pull up to bail out? And they said, no, just hold up your TS card, we'll punch it on the way by when we come back. Hold it off the water and ditch it. That was the fact. That really was it. Anyway, we got out to a certain point and turned, and we had the whole maneuver, the whole formation had them turn, and somehow we're still right in there. And pretty soon we made another turn to line up with our direction. And after a while, they just, at the time, everyone just jumped up 2,000 feet out of the clouds, and there's all 61 airplanes all together. That felt good. That was a good feeling to me when I saw everybody came up. Nobody was running into anybody. And we climbed high, and we crossed the coast below Udine. It's about midway of northern Italy, and the Alps are behind that. The bombers had come over from the right. They were escorted by P-38, so they already were hitting their target up there. but we were left of the target. About the time we got up to, 16,000, we saw the first plane we saw. My flight leader, I was flying his wing, his element, and he took off after this plane, and he fired at him, and I saw one flash on a wingtip, but then he overran him. And the plane went this way, so I went after him, because I was back where I could. And we went in a kind of a dive, and boy, I've never seen a plane turn inside out, doing everything in the world to avoid getting hit. And suddenly he turned and he was in front of me, and I could see only his cockpit and wing. And I just fired, and I saw about 50 rounds smash into his cockpit area and wing area. And then he must have been hit, and so he went down, and he spun like that all the way down. He never came out of that spin. And so I assumed that the pilot was hit then, because all the shots were right at the cockpit and the wing room.
Also on the mission was Major Herschel Green, who in his memoirs recalled the day's events, which started badly after he found his regular P-47, which carried his number 11 marking, was not ready for action. With no other choice, he climbed aboard the P-47 of Captain Bun Hearn, which carried the nose art, the Star of Altoona. Herky, flying lead for the 317th that day, later learned that his gunnery during the mission had set a new record for the group.
I spotted a number of large aircraft in loose formation flying at very low altitude. I led my flight down, and diving almost vertically, we reached the deck with far too much speed for good accurate shooting. I tried to swing around so we'd be making our attack out of the sun, but it was about high noon and the sun was almost straight overhead. We were still very, very fast when we hit them. The planes were Ju-52 transports flying at 1,000 feet, apparently strung out trying to establish a spacing interval for landing. Well, I started down the line. As I exploded the last aircraft in the string, I switched to the next plane, got off a quick burst setting it on fire, and then switched to another, followed by a fourth, all with the same fatal results. I hauled that P-47 around in a vertical gut-wrenching turn to go back for a second pass. The extreme high G forces momentarily drained the strength from arms and legs, and by the time I completed my turn, the Ju-52s were no more. We were close to several airfields, and the ground fire was terrifying. I scooted out of its immediate range and began climbing back to altitude with the rest of the flight strung out behind me. Before we reached 10,000 feet, an ME-109 heading for the deck came flying past us, fleeing from the fight above, which was now in full swing. High above us, P-47s and ME-109s were twisting, turning, and darting like a cloud of gnats. Several smoke smears made twisted scribbles in the sky. When the 109 from above came diving past us, we made in-place reversals, just like a drill team, and started after him. At one point, I was chasing the 109 right on the ground when I realized there was an airplane just a few feet above me and slightly to my left, shooting at the same plane. It was Edsel Polk, and he couldn't see me because I was hidden by the nose of this plane, so I quickly slipped out to the right and out of danger. Paul got that 109, but as he pulled up, he flew through a bunch of high-voltage power lines that crossed the river. Great balls of blue fire flashed all along the broken power lines. Polk's jug never missed a beat and kept on a-flying. Again, I began climbing, and this time I encountered the MA-202 diving in the opposite direction. Turning as quickly as I could, I dropped behind him and tried to close the gap to a reasonable firing range. I was trying my best to catch him, at the same time remembering the 8th Air Force warning that the P-47 is a good airplane, but don't ever get caught below 15,000 feet in it. The 202, after flying straight and level for about a minute, rolled into a tight 360-degree turn and straightened out. I followed him in the turn and managed to gain a couple hundred feet altitude on him, which I converted to additional speed by slowly bleeding that off. He made a second 360-degree turn with the same results. When he started a third turn, I was in range and I let him have it. I saw multiple flashes around the cockpit. The pilot must have been hit, for the airplane executed a perfect snap roll at that extreme low altitude, coming back in almost level flight just before the right wing dropped slowly to the ground and that 202 cartwheeled away in a ball of fire. By then I was alone, separated from the others in the melee. I decided the best action was to head south for home. As I climbed through 15,000 feet heading south, I saw a twin-engine plane about 5,000 feet below and behind me. I throttled back and began an easy descending right turn so I could come down on his tail. When I opened fire, I saw hits on his left engine, which just started to burn uncontrollably. I also saw tracers come from my guns, indicating I only had 50 rounds in each one. I pulled off and watched to see what would happen. It crash landed and exploded on impact. Again, I head towards home. Almost the same situation developed for a second time, but because I thought I was low on ammunition, I continued south and didn't try for a 7th victory. Now, the ultimate irony of this tale is I was flying Captain Bun Hearn's airplane on that mission. My own P-47 was redlined for maintenance. Now, the P-47 could carry 800 rounds of ammunition for each one of its 8 machine guns. Most of us, however, carried only 400 rounds per gun because we felt the weight reduction significantly improved aircraft performance. After landing, I learned that Bun did not subscribe to that theory. His plane was loaded with 800 rounds per gun. The punchline is I actually landed with more ammunition remaining than I thought I had at mission start.
As the last of the 325th Thunderbolts arrived back at base, what lay behind them 300 miles away was a scene of total devastation. The Checkertails in 30 minutes had destroyed 38 enemy planes, which now lay strewn across Axis-held territory, with a further 6 aircraft listed as probable. As Lieutenant Colonel Baszler stepped down from his P-47, named Big Stud, he was greeted by General Nathan F. Twining, commander of the 15th Air Force. With a beaming smile, Twining reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver star, which he promptly pinned to Baszler's chest for his leadership during the day's action. As February rolled into March, the bomber flights came under a sustained attack from what appeared to be a much more experienced enemy fighter group. On the 3rd of the month, the Checkertails were on an escort mission for bombers heading to targets in Rome. As they neared their target, Me-109s suddenly plunged into the formation, opening fire at anything that could get in their sights. The Checkertails immediately responded, and in the ensuing battle, they managed to carve a path for the bombers to reach the target, while downing 6 of the enemy. But the cost had been high. 4 of the clan failed to return from the mission. On the 10th of March, the Checkertails engaged in another huge battle over the marshalling yards of Padva, and another 10 enemy planes were shot from the sky. Once again, the clan suffered losses, with 3 of their number killed in action. Tragically, one of the P-47s lost was due to a case of double mistaken identity. Lieutenant Hudson's P-47 had been shot up by 109s and was beating a retreat. Lieutenant Jimmy Jones spotted him and mistook him for a 190. As Jones dived toward him, Hudson saw what he thought was a 190 diving on him, but it was Lieutenant Jones's P-47. With a short burst of his guns, Hudson critically damaged Jones's P-47. He could only watch helplessly as the stricken P-47 plowed into the ground with no chance of survival for the pilot. It was around this time pilots of the 325th were relocated to the airbase at the shores of Lake Lucena in Italy, after Foggia No. 1 was allocated to bomber groups of the 15th Air Force. The new home for the Checkertail clan at Lucena was a welcome change to their previous bases. This one had a lake running alongside it and was near to the town. This gave the crews a choice of a swim on their days off or a visit to the shops or other establishments in the vicinity. Barry Davis recalls typical recreational pursuits between missions.
On the days we didn't fly, we just wandered around the countryside there, improved our tent. We found a bunch of bricks, liberated them from whoever they belonged to, whatever Italians belonged to, and so we had a brick floor to our tent, and we took the crates, the boxes that the wing tanks came in, and extended the sides of a tent out with those, made it more that way. Go into the little town of Lucena and just look around. We really didn't have much volleyball. Now volleyball, we were losing an awful lot of fingers to volleyball. The guys were serious about playing that. We built us an officers club. Of course, we'd go over and had cheap drinks, and we'd listen to Axis Sal, play her nice American numbers that make you want to go home. We'd listen to that at night. And generally, although I was never a poker player, I never enjoyed winning. I hated to lose. So I was never a poker player, but generally there'd be a game of poker going on somewhere.
Another way found by crews to pass their time was to paint artwork onto the aircraft they regularly flew. Earlier in the war, paint supplies had been sparse, so anything seen as extracurricular was disapproved. However, this concern diminished as the war progressed, and pilots and crews were given the leeway to add artwork and names to the aircraft. With great relish, they added nose art and names of loved ones or character traits of the pilot or crew to their mounts. On the 28th of March, the Checkertails once again were in action, downing 7 Me-109s, 4 of which were credited to the actions of Lieutenant John R. Booth. While Booth was engaged in a tight-turning dogfight, for which the Thunderbolt was not ideally suited, he came under attack from another 3 109s. Using nothing but gut instinct and more than his fair share of lady luck, Booth managed to get into position to get off quick shots at 2 of the bandits. While one bandit exploded in a huge plume of flame, the other rolled over and moments later was strewn across the landscape in a huge ball of fire. Immediately, another 109 raced toward Booth in a head-on attack with all guns blazing. With adrenaline pumping and his overwhelming instinct for survival kicking in, he pulled the P-47 into a steep bank as hard as he possibly could away from the incoming fighter. Booth felt a tremendous lurch to the right, and then, with control stick shuddering, managed to gain control of his aircraft. The 109's impact had ripped away 5 feet of the starboard wing of the P-47. But to everyone's amazement, the Jug was still flying. But the 109 tumbled away behind Booth's P-47 and, incredibly, crashed into another 109 that was closing in on Booth's 6 o'clock. Both 109s exploded in a huge ball of flame, leaving Booth to limp home nursing his damaged plane all the way back to Lucena. On March 31st, Bob Baszler was replaced as commanding officer of the Checkertails by Lieutenant Colonel Chester Sluter. Bob Baszler had been one of the most popular leaders of the group, and his talent for leadership and communications saw him move up to the 306th Fighter Wing headquarters, where he became Assistant Chief of Staff to Brigadier General Dean C. Strother. The fighters of the Checkertails clan were keen to show their new CO the skill and quality of the men he had just inherited. The 70th mission for the P-47 pilots of the group did just that. 49 Thunderbolts took part in an escort mission in support of B-17s and B-24s heading to Zagreb in Yugoslavia. Approximately 60 miles southwest of the target, a group of 40 Me-109s engaged the 325th Fighters. A short time later, 9 of the Checkertails pilots scored victories. Continuing with this success, Major Herky Green the following day destroyed an Me-110 to bring his victory count up to 13, for which he became the ranking ace still in flight status for the clan. Although the Checkertails regularly left their mark on Axis-held territory, not all of the pilots returned safely home. On April 18th, on a fighter sweep of the Udina area on the 77th mission, John Gonda was listed as missing in action. He recalls the events of that fateful day.
An aircraft came right through our group and kept on going down. I broke off from my flight and I started to follow that aircraft that attacked us. And I could only go so far, and I had to break off the chase, and I tried to get together with my flight. Well, as I pulled up, and I started to get altitude, and the engine conked out. And so I tried to figure out what happened, and I wasn't getting any result. So I turned the aircraft around and headed back towards the ocean, and I lost as much altitude as I could. When I got low to the seashore, I start hitting what sounded like rocks hitting the bottom of my airplane. And so I kicked the airplane out to sea, And it got out maybe about 1,000 feet or so. And I tried to crash land into the sea. And the airplane was not covered with water. Just water came into the cockpit. But I was able to get out, and it seems to me like I was able to wade to shore, and it seemed like the water was about this high when I was walking ashore. I saw it was a house right near the seashore there. And when I got to the house, there was an old gentleman there. He was just sort of wandering around. And when I got on land, he motioned me into the house. When the next thing we knew, we looked out and there was these soldiers coming down the street, looking for me because of course they saw me up in the air. They were shooting at me. They came to the house. They made me a prisoner of war. One soldier had a rifle strapped to his shoulders, and so he marched me to this little village, and that's where the crowd was gathered. They were kind of smiling at me. It looked like they were glad to see me or something. And I smiled back at them.
From the period April 12th to May 23rd, minimal enemy fighters were encountered. To utilize their time, the 325th increased their fighter sweeps. The rest of the Klan's missions were spent on escort duties, but these were frustrating times, as the enemy seemed reticent to show a presence. On the 19th of May, Major General Nathan Twining, the 15th Air Force commander, arrived at the base. His purpose that day was to honor the courage and skill of the pilots who had taken part in the July 30th, 1943 and January 30th, 1944 missions, which had caused so much destruction to the enemy. This newly discovered archive footage, although badly damaged by age, shows the events as they unfolded that day. For each mission, the 325th was awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation, and after accepting the presentation, a formal parade was held in which the platoon of pilots and headquarters staff passed by the general in a display worthy of the unit's newly held awards. The last of the Checkertails P-47 missions took place on May 24, 1944, with the Thunderbolts making an escort run to Wallersdorf Airfield in Austria. Making victories that day were Lieutenant Don Kearns, accounting for 2 ME-109s, and Lieutenants Hiawatha Mohawk, Robert Rausch, Robert Bass, and Bob Barker, each securing individual 109s. As they turned for home, the final tally for the Thunderbolt era of the 325th read 97 missions completed, with 3,626 sorties flown, for a total of 15,280 combat hours. The Checkertails scored 153 aerial victories with a loss of 38 of their own. As the P-47s arrived back at base, a line of fully prepared North American P-51 Mustangs waited. This new stock of aircraft that had arrived over the previous few days now stood ready to carry the 325th pilots into battle and continue the legend of the 325th Fighter Group.